Alex Swallow. Welcome to the Coach's Journey podcast.
Thanks, Robbie. It's really exciting to be here.
Yeah. So, as some listeners will know, you are one of the new team of hosts for the podcast. And so I'm curious, as someone who's listened to the show a lot over the years, I don't know, but what's it like in this moment to know in some way that although we've had many conversations over many years, which I'm sure we'll talk about, this is a slightly different one where you are appearing on a podcast that you've listened to.
Yeah, it's really exciting and also kind of weird. It's a bit like sort of Wizard of Ozzy, I suppose. And it's also weird because, I'm sure we'll get into, you've coached me and we've had lots of different types of conversations. So this feels like yet another conversation in the many conversations we've had.
Yeah, the Wizard of Oz is such a good thing, and unfortunately, the disappointing truth about like what Robbie Swale is like off podcast.
No, the analogy only stretches so far, I'm sure.
I mean, so Alex, I was thinking, and I tried to find it, and I couldn't. So I was trying to find the first messages, however we exchanged them, that we exchanged, and I managed to pretty much date it from my email because my email goes back a long way, and I could have guessed that it was about then anyway, but I couldn't find the actual message. So here's how I remember how we connected. In 2011, so I found the date. So you added me on LinkedIn in 2011, or I got a reminder. Maybe I deleted it from my email, but I don't know. I got a reminder that you had added me on LinkedIn in October 2011. That's the first. I couldn't find it when I searched Alex Swallow in my email, but when I searched Alexander Swallow, I found this. And my memory of how that worked is we were both featured on a Trustees Week, in a Trustees Week blog or campaign as young charity trustees or something like that. And I can remember, I knew the picture straight away that they'd used of me, because I remember it was a good picture. It was me in like a Viking helmet or something that I had as in the costume department of the charity that I was a trustee of at the time. And funny, we won't put a link to that blog in the show notes because you can find a little blog if you want. You can Google Robbie Swale Trustees Week 2011 or something. But what happens is you go to it, you get this brief flash of it before they've got something set up on their website to take you from what you're trying to look at to the Trustees Week homepage of this year. So you can't stay on it. It's really annoying. Anyway, my memory is you connected with me somehow after that. And I said, like, who are you, in some polite way. And you said, well, we were both featured as trustees in this Trustees Week thing. And it might have been then, and I'm setting up or have set up a thing for young charity trustees, which again, we might get to. I'm aware that memory is not perfect. Is that how you remember it? What do you remember?
That's hilarious. I hadn't remembered that at all. So my recollection is that somehow there were two great people called Robbie doing stuff that were kind of social. And so I literally got confused between you and another Robbie at the time, who may have also been doing vaguely trustee related things, in a voluntary capacity. And so I remember connecting to you and thinking you were interesting. But I think I remember thinking, oh, I've got to not get confused between these two Robbies. And I think the other Robbie maybe even had a slightly similar surname to you or something. And so over time, my picture of you as a distinct Robbie began to emerge. That's how I remember it.
Hey, so funny. So I feel like this is a bit of like a sitcom or something. It feels a little bit like that, where like I've accidentally, what is it in? Someone can write in to let us know this. There's a show, maybe it's Friends or something, where there's a bit where somebody goes out with the wrong person, has a wonderful time, and then later realize, that then there's like tension in the relationship because they realize that the person meant to ask out their flatmate or initially or something like that. Feels a little bit like that. So you don't remember who, but I won because do you remember who the other Robbie was still?
I might be able to find him, but no, I don't. And so, the thing is as well, is I think it's really funny to look back at that time, because basically I used the work that I was doing around getting young people to join charity boards to also fulfill my curiosity of meeting interesting people in and around the charity sector, which was wonderful. And so I basically had a ready-made excuse, which I'd always recommend to people, to connect to loads of people without them thinking I was completely crazy a stalker or both. So it was quite nice to have something I could hang that on. And so I can definitely imagine myself using the fact we'd appeared in something together as a nice little hook to say, I'm legitimate here. I'm not so unusual. Like,
yeah, yeah, it's such a good point, and it's one that, you know, you'll have seen me doing with other coaches quite a lot. I'm aware that I do it now, and I do it because I learned it from other people, which is, yeah, there's always a legitimate reason. Like you called it an excuse then, but what you really mean is a reason. And there's always a reason. You just have to, often it's just about finding the authentic way that is kind of socially acceptable to share that reason. And a very cool, you know, podcasts sometimes fulfill this for people. I guess that's part of what this show did for me, although I don't think it was exactly why I set it up. Research projects, people write white papers, you know, like a LinkedIn group, communities. There's so many good ways that if you want to start connecting with people, you have in your hands we all have in our hands to make something and then use that as a reason to connect with people, a vehicle to connect with people.
I think the reason, I think you're completely right. It's better called a reason. I think the reason why I use the word excuse is because one of my values is curiosity. And so I think for me that I was always going to find a way to do that. And of course, I care very deeply about charity boards and have done loads of work around charity boards. But if it wasn't that, I might have found something else. I was just like, what my mind, I think, automatically wants me to connect with interesting people. And so it's an excuse in the sense that I will find a way to do that. And there might be a wide variety of ways, if you've just mentioned, in order for that to happen successfully.
Yeah. Yeah, I love it. I love it. And you've definitely done that. You're a person, you know, a person who I really admire for the way that you connect people. We might get to that. I think before we kind of dive in further, like it's worth just slowing down. Like in fact, let's do it. So I found this great thing that you wrote, and I'm going to read it back to you if my thing works. So this is from Alex's book, How to Become an Influencer. The most impressive people, in my view, are those who are able to do amazing things and inspire countless people while never forgetting to be kind to others or forgetting that their own success depends on the people supporting them. Like for me, when I read that, I was just like, that's exactly how I feel about Alex. It's like there's an incredible generosity to what you do. And I kind of, we'll get to this in this conversation. There's almost a sense for me with you, Alex, that like, I had this a little doing research ahead of this interview, that you're so down to earth and like self-effacing that it's easy. It's possible for even me, who's known you for 12 years, to forget a whole bunch. You've done so many amazing things. I've forgotten a whole bunch of them. And it's like, so it's really important to remember that. But for people who are interested, you've had a huge influence and impact on me and my work. And there are just so many ways that that's true. Again, it was like one of the things that I'd kind of forgotten, but that I remembered doing research for this, was just how much I learned how to do social media, but particularly LinkedIn from you. I found myself on a blog, possibly linked from your book, which I was getting into, from about then, 2012, 2013, 2014, 2015. That's probably more like 14 or 15 or maybe 16, about how to use LinkedIn. I was like, I've been on this blog, 8 years ago, and I do these things now, partly because, or mostly because, I read them here. For people who are interested, I'm pretty sure the only reason that I knew that you could write blogs on LinkedIn, which is why I now have a blog on LinkedIn with 350 odd posts, is because you had a blog on LinkedIn. The reason there's a little bold italic bit at the bottom of all my blogs going back through it is because you had one. So there's all of that influence, but also, what people won't know is, and you can read some of this. I was thinking just before this. So I mentioned when I had Jennifer Garvey-Berger on the show last year, I kind of tried to make myself do something with another book that I've written, which is, draft titled The Power to Choose. I'd probably end up with a different one, I would have thought. I told Jennifer that I would publish it so publicly then, because I thought that would make me do it. And the truth is, there's more to that. And that's why it's not out yet, a year and a bit later. But you gave me an amazingly generous amount of support with that book project. So people can read the first, probably half of the book on my website if they want to. And it is unrecognizable in the form that it is even now to the form that you read it in. A lot is about incredibly generous support and reflections you gave on that. And there have been all kinds of other things. I was remembering that I'm pretty sure you weren't the only person, but you were a person who said to me, I think you should do some videos a long time ago, and gave me some good enough reason to do that. And I don't think you were the only person, but you might have been, the third one or something, by which point I can't really ignore this feedback. And therefore the straw breaks the camel's back. And I was wondering, think I would have got to something like a podcast in the end anyway, but it's a bit like coaching. Like we can't really know how coaching changes an outcome. Like I don't know for sure that the people I coach wouldn't do the things they do without the coaching, but I can be pretty sure that they do those things faster or they feel better as they do them. And to me, that contribution, for example, with the videos was kind of instrumental in a real, like me going into super resistance and breaking through it. The other thing is, and I still get this now, I just feel like you're someone who's just had an incredible faith and belief in me and my work for so long, in a way that I still find surprising. I still think, like, why does Alex Swallow, like, this was definitely the energy at the start. It was huge for me because of who you are and how you show up, and particularly how you were showing up then, which we might get to, is feels slightly different to how you show up now. Like, it was huge that you were saying, you were showing that faith in me, and it's still paying back, Alex. I had a client this year, a rare client, who came entirely via the internet. And I said, how did you find me? And he said, perusing as an art form, and then pointed to one of your most read ever articles, 100 lessons from 100 articles on LinkedIn, which features one of my blogs. So I'm sorry that he paid me money to coach him after that and not you, but thank you.
Wow, Robbie. First, thank you for the beautiful words. And my honest reflection right now is that I'm feeling quite emotional. Like, it was really beautiful to hear that. It was beautiful to hear those reflections about me. But actually, the bit I felt emotional at was when you were talking about my support for you, and particularly when you said, what is it that I see in your work, and you wonder that. And I think for me, I have this burning feeling that when I see people doing great work in the world, but people who I think could either do even more, so that might be that there's something like they haven't written a book and they could write a book, and that would be another way for them to share their work. But in particular, when I think I'm getting so much from somebody, and I think other people deserve to get that thing as well. Like, it shouldn't just be for me. So actually thinking about it almost in religious terms, I'm going to go on what seems like perhaps a slight tangent, but it's almost like, and I'm not hugely religious, probably spiritual rather than religious, but it's almost like when someone wants to be evangelical about something that they know to be true and has changed their life. And so for me, when I see people doing stuff where I can be like, yeah, that really resonates with me, I'm really learning something, I really love what that person's putting out into the world, it feels such a joy to me to be able to connect other people to that. And that's just such a genuine, wonderful thing to do.
Mm. Yeah, and I think that is one of your superpowers. That does come across in the work you do. And I guess what I'm trying to tell you is that it works, like it's meaningful.
Thank you.
So Alex, like, I'm really excited. Like I said, a little bit of my version of that is this experiment we're running with the Coach's Journey this year to grow the show, to have more people on board, like each of the people. I'm super excited that the listeners are going to get to know you better over this year, as well as the rest of the team over these episodes. I'm looking forward to you being in this seat very much, and being able to listen to that. And yeah, in a way, take just a person, I mean, a whole group of people, but a group of people I think are amazing, and that really get this thing that I'm trying to do, and like give them the reins to do it more and do it better in different ways. And then, but like you kind of know, probably know where we're going soon. Let's go there now. Like, there's a way that we always start these conversations as we're gonna by the end of this conversation, we're gonna give people a great chance to get to know you, if they, more than even than they have already, which I hope is quite a bit. And but where we'll start is, where did you first come across coaching?
Excellent. Thanks, Robbie. Well, this is definitely one of those behind the curtain moments, because this is a question that not only you always ask guests, but I will be asking my own guests, and we'll all be asking the guests. So it feels an integral part of that. And I think the answers to the questions we've heard from different people have not only been so many and varied, but have been so surprising in certain ways. And actually, it's funny that I was saying I was getting emotional, because this part of the conversation feels a little emotional to me, because the person who I learned about coaching from has sadly passed away. And that was my coach and my friend, Ian Lawson, absolutely extraordinary man. When I became chief executive of the Small Charities Coalition, a small national charity, they very kindly linked me up with Ian, who did some free coaching with me. And I also went on the towards that standing leadership program with him and his colleagues. But him and his wife became a friend of me and my wife. And he was just the most wonderful, generous man, with incredible gravitas, knowledge, and wisdom, but just real humanity. And very much was the sort of person who I just imagined I'd learn from for the rest of my life. And I kind of thought I'd get to know better and better. And now, in a weird way, though I'm nowhere at his level, I would be a peer, because I've moved into coaching myself, which would feel, I think, very different and exciting. So it was an amazingly positive experience to get the coaching from him, both because he was an excellent coach, but just because of the empathy and humanity that he demonstrated towards me as a pretty young, I just turned 30, I think, chief executive in a reasonably prominent role. And it was just an amazing experience. And to be honest, at that time, and for a long time after, I didn't particularly think about being a coach myself, but that certainly planted that seed for me to see the power of coaching and what good coaches could be like.
Yeah. Wow. And what, if you slow down with that and all those amazing things that it sounds like Ian did with you, or was, as a person, what did you take away from that initial coaching engagement?
I think for me, it was that brilliant balance that I think coaching can have, and which I think I'd like to emulate a bit in my coaching, which is that a coach can follow a structure and kind of have some things that they'll know that they have helped other clients. So when I was wrestling with a problem, Ian could bring me something that was genuinely helpful, which he'd seen working with other people. But at the same time, which is so important to me philosophically, he treated me like an individual. There was no one size fits all. Um, I was in control of wherever conversation went. I was in control of what I wanted as support from him. And so he felt like a trusted confidant and supporter, as well as somebody who was providing me with resources that would enable me to do my job better and be happier in my role. And so I think through him, my early experience of coaching was so good, because I saw the human behind the coach. And I saw it even more because we became friends, but I probably saw that from our first meeting, and that was amazing for me.
Yeah. Yeah. Do you remember any of the frameworks, or, like, I'm just going back to being a 30, and let's talk a bit more about this in a few minutes, or come back to it. But, being a 30-year-old trustee, 30-year-old chief exec of like you say, a relatively prominent charity, that role, is fun to dive into it. You had a bunch of articles in the Guardian, presumably on the back of that. So it was like, just to make it really clear to people, it was prominent, right? You were getting quoted in that. You were in like a government review panel. There was lots of this stuff going on. It's quite a thing to do as a 30-year-old. It was quite a thing to do for anybody. Yeah. Do you remember any of the frameworks he shared, or any of the shifts that really helped you in that time?
To be honest, I can remember some of the the things that he worked through with me, but not in great detail. It's more the feeling I had, of him as a person, because I think that um, it was just somebody who I didn't have to impress. I didn't have to report to, who didn't provide any level of judgment, who respected me, but also who brought his wisdom to bear on the situation. And so for me, it's more of a feeling, but I think it's also mixed up in all the feelings of how he became a friend. So, you know, I didn't get to, sadly, spend lots and lots of time with him, but just to give an example of the sort of generous man he was, that might give some context. So he became a member of the Worshipful Company of Management Consultants, and I didn't even realize there's such a thing. Some people will know, some people might not, but there's all these really old, fascinating guilds in London, like the cloth makers and the vintners, and in open house weekend you can sometimes go in and see them. The only reason I heard about them was because charities apply to them. Some of the bigger ones and more wealthy ones have the Cloth Makers Foundation, for example, is a major funder. And so the Worshipful Company of Management Consultants is presumably a lot newer. I presume in the 1700s there weren't specifically management consultants. And he basically, my wife and I were invited by him and his wife to come along and see him be made a member. And it was held in a beautiful boat on the Thames. Now, that's an example. That was such a singular experience, and also the generosity of being their guests and spending time with them. And this was a man who essentially, owed me nothing. He could have been polite, but very much kept me at arm's length. But he was just that sort of generous personality. And I can tell by the way that other people spoke about him, and I went to his funeral, that it's just, that's how he came across as a person. And so I suppose for me, if that was my early imprint that a coach could be, I mean, that's almost a difficult one for other coaches to live up to, I suppose. I had such a good early impression.
Yeah. Yeah, we might come back to the challenges of having such a good early impression, but mostly to me it sounds like what a gift to have met and known him. And look, like, I think people who are listening will kind of hear in what I've just said about you echoes of what you've just said about him. So we get that weird thing that sometimes the things we admire in people, even though this is impossible to see for ourselves and really accept, are things we have in ourselves. I wouldn't be surprised. I doubt you'll be in the Worshipful Company of Management Consultants. I like the idea that it might have actually been from the 14th century, and we just didn't know there were management consultants back then. But I doubt you'll be in that. But I know that you are inviting people into spaces of all kinds, in the way that you are and work. Alex, do you remember why did he give away the coaching? Why was the coaching free?
So there was a really lovely link. My chair of trustees at the time, Deborah Alcock-Tyler, who's a big figure in the charity industry, she had worked with him, I think it's something called the Work Foundation. I think it was maybe previously called something else. So he was a personal friend of hers, and it was basically, I presume, as a favor to her that he came in and supported me. But I want to make sure I say one thing before we move on, is that I think as part of my journey towards becoming a coach, there were then a small number of people, you very much included, who I then sort of saw becoming coaches, or I started to notice people who were coaches in a different way. I suppose it's like that, what is it, the reticular activating system or something. It's where, once you start to notice something, and then your brain can pick up on it. And so I think one of the things that was so inspirational, important to me about your journey, was the fact that you shared that journey with people. So both I was, already impressed with your work and with you as a person, and then with the things you shared, but also you were very generous in your sharing, so that you would share your trials and tribulations of becoming a coach. And I believe that your most read article is how you became a full-time coach in a short period of time. And so I really enjoyed that journey. And I think that would have been a big part, you and a select group of other coaches, in helping me to think about coaching. But I would definitely say that the two most important people for me becoming a coach have been Ian and then you, like beyond a shadow of a doubt.
And we'll probably talk later about why I'm really glad that you're moving into the coaching industry. But it's partly, and maybe we get to this, it's partly because I have seen what you did in the charity sector, like seen what you made happen and what was possible really in that. I guess the time that I've known you. So when was Ian coaching you?
So this would have been when I started at the Small Charities Coalition, which was like in the early 2010s.
So probably about the same time we were connected.
We met.
Yeah. But of course, I came to that later. And when I look at your journey since I've known you, it feels like there are kind of three phases. There's the charity sector phase. There's the influence expert phase, which we'll kind of get to. Not that these things aren't connected. And I think that is one of the most interesting questions, things to discover for me in this conversation. And then this new phase, which is, like 2 years in or 2-3 years in, something like that. Before we kind of jump too much forward, give us a sense, for people who don't know you, of what brought you to the Small Charities Coalition and that chief exec role, age of 30. And I think that somewhere in there was a design, like you'd written down or had the thought, I'd love to be the chief executive of a charity. Like that was in that. But also there's like a breakfast meeting or a coffee with somebody that like makes this happen in an unexpected way. And before that, there was a journey too. So I don't know how much, tell that however you like, but give us a sense of how did you come to be the chief exec of that charity?
Yeah, I think for me, it was probably about what we've already both mentioned. So I set up an organization called Young Charity Trustees. So I joined the charity sector in 2009. I started working for a charity supporting isolated older people in poverty.
And why, if you don't mind me asking, well, I mean, yeah, even if you do mind me asking, I'm going to ask anyway. Why did you apply for that job? Was there something about the charity sector that was important? Because it looks like that from the outside, like the charity sector is something you care about in lots of ways. What took you there?
Well, it was bizarre, really, and also this ends up being, I'll explain, this ends up being particularly bizarre because I also met my wife at that charity, which is a very small charity. But the set of circumstances which led to me being in that role were quite, I think, quite interesting because I'd done a variety of things since leaving university. So I studied politics at Cambridge. I helped to run a voluntary teaching program in Romania. I went to Japan for 2 years and taught on the JET program. I was a private tutor in North London, almost exclusively to the North London Tamil community. I was an intern for 2 members of Parliament, one in the constituency office and one in Parliament. And I was basically at that time, I was running out of money. Like I was struggling to find a job in London of the type, and I don't know whether other people have this. I think for me, moving to London, I felt that like I wanted to get a particular type of job in London. As in, I'm from Brighton. I now live in Sheffield, but I'm originally from Brighton. And if I had just got any job in London that I could have also got in Brighton, then I'd have felt that I'd failed in some way. So the sort of jobs that I was applying for were things like, I think I applied for a job at the Korean embassy. I applied at some health body. I maybe applied at other charities. I think I might have done youth organizations, things like that. And what it was that I ended up seeing an advert in the it was either the London Light or the London Paper, which makes me feel very old because they no longer exist. I presume you remember both of those, Robbie, yeah?
Yeah, so they were the London Paper, I don't remember so well. I must have maybe, unless it was only in London in the few years that I didn't live there. I lived in London mostly between 2003 and 2013 or something. It's possible I was away for a few years, it was there. But yeah, London Light became Standard Light, right? It was like a free paper you could pick up in places. That's what I remember.
Exactly. So that it was it was those papers and the Metro, and then the Evening Standard became free. So by the end, I loved papers, so I was just deluged by papers. And essentially, in one of those papers, it had an advert for, it was called, it no longer exists, it's called the National Benevolent Fund for the Aged, really old school sounding name. And I saw this advert, and the role was to run a program called Breaks Away, which essentially it took old people away for holiday breaks at British seaside resorts. And some of these people last traveled when they were evacuated during the war. So they'd lived in poverty, some of them, for all their lives, perhaps. They were bringing up grandchildren in certain cases, and they just never got time themselves. So I applied for this role, and I didn't get the role. And actually, it was a role that later my wife ended up taking over. So I didn't get that role, but they said to me, oh, there's this other role, which is fundraising, communication, and development, I think it was called. So there's another role you could apply for. So I think I had another interview. I was much more suited to that role. But the reason why this story is so weird is because I said to my mum, oh, I've got this job. And she said, oh, I've heard of that charity. And I thought it's very unlikely because it's a tiny charity, like 4 members of staff. And it turned out that my own grandmother, my nanny, had been on a holiday. The last holiday she went on was via this charity before she'd passed away. And then that ended up being the service that my now wife ran. And I just thought that, and my mum even had the luggage label because it was the same logo. so maybe reticular activating system in some form. I'd remembered that. I'd seen that advert because it had stood out to me from my own grandmother years and years earlier going on the trip. I don't know.
Yeah. Well, you know, and I guess it does make sense that if you picked up even a sprinkling of how likely meaningful it was for her to get to go on that trip at presumably a good old age, you know, that therefore became a meaningful cause, which therefore meant you didn't skip past it as quickly as you might have skipped past some others. But we'll never know that kind of thing.
We'll never know.
And so you were doing that role. That was your first role in the charity sector.
Was. And then essentially it relates to the story that you've said earlier about supporting young people on charity boards. I set up an organization called Young Charity Trustees, which also no longer exists. I handed over the social media resources to another organization who does fantastic work. And I became a trustee of a charity in London. And I just thought, again, which is always my thought, if this is useful for me and I'm getting something out of it, and if they want people like me reasonably inexperienced, and I didn't know very much about the area that the charity worked in, which was learning disabilities. And so I thought, well, if they want people like me, then definitely other young people would definitely be able to do this role too. So I became an advocate for that. And it was an advocate both for young people to think about joining charity boards and for charities to reach out to young people and for the sector as a whole to reach out to young people. And so going back to what you said about that breakfast meeting or what have you, was essentially Deborah Alcott-Tyler, who was the chair of the Small Charities Coalition at the time. I met her through my work for Young Charity Trustees. She was incredibly generous. As I remember the conversation, she essentially asked me, do you know the third sector minister? And I basically said no. And she got out her phone and sent him a text. And so I ended up having a meeting with him as well. But through her and through the chief executive of the Small Charities Coalition at the time, I found out more about the organization and that there was an opportunity to apply. Didn't think I was going to get it, just threw my hat in the ring.
Yeah, and did.
And I think I did because for 2 reasons. One, I think probably I'd just been quite visible, quite out there, and it was a really small charity. Again, no longer exists. It's a really small charity, but it punched above its weight. For example, I had someone on my board who's the chief executive of Anthony Nolan. So, you know, I had some really high-powered people in and around this organization. So I think I'd given myself a bit of a profile. But the other thing is that the charity was actually an amalgamation of that and something called, I think it was called Charity Trustee Networks, which meant that my interest in governance and getting young people into boards was quite a natural fit for a lot of the work they were doing. So yeah, that was an exciting time.
Yeah. And we can do let's do a tiny sidebar on trusteeship, because I think it is it's a very interesting thing to be able to do. I mean, you could probably do this better than me, but let me do a little bit from my background. So I've been a trustee of 3 organizations, starting with the Students' Union, then 2 charities in York, theatre-related charities. And essentially, as a career change, like it fulfilled a bunch of functions for me, all of which could be functions it fulfilled at different stages in people's lives, separately altogether. It was a chance to be involved strategically in organizations, which I love to do, and which is sometimes hard when you're starting out in your career. You end up doing, administrative jobs, kind of, if you're lucky, or unless you're a smart person and you make your way differently to how I did it. You get to do some meaningful work. Like to get on the board of a big charity is quite hard in some ways, but to get on the board of a small charity, mostly they just are desperate for smart, committed people who can help this cause that people care about exist. And there are many, many, as you will know from your work at the Small Charities Commission, small charities everywhere. And just an amazing way to kind of give back. But for me also, for sure, it allowed me to shift careers into the arts. By the time I got my first job in the arts, which was a managerial job running an art centre in Yorkshire, they had to take a gamble on me because I was 25 or whatever, but they took that gamble because partly the reason I made it possible for them to take that gamble was because I had been involved strategically in a bunch of things as a trustee. So for people's clients, or if people want to support a cause, it's an amazing thing to do.
Yeah, I think you've summed it up beautifully. I just appeal to any coaches or any aspiring coaches, or indeed anyone listening to this, to just look into it. There's something called Trustees Week, which is worth looking into. But I love what you said about, which I'd almost forgotten myself, about the sort of getting strategically involved. And that's what feels so different, I think, when you're a trustee, especially if you're early in your career. I didn't have that sort of involvement in my daytime job. So I was essentially being paid for something where I generally took reasonably low-level decisions, and then not being paid for something where I took very high-level decisions, because typically trusteeship isn't paid for in this country. But it was just an amazing thing to be able to do. And it satisfied my curiosity as well, because again, I had a legitimate reason to talk to all sorts of people around the charity I was a trustee of. And since then, I've been chair of another charity, one in Sheffield. But it just gives you the chance to talk to lots of people, to find out lots, and just to find out what makes organizations tick and what makes the world go round. So I think it's a brilliant experience.
Yeah, I completely agree. And was I right that I feel like I've read this maybe a long time ago, or maybe you said it to me, that being the CEO of a charity had been a goal or an aspiration for you?
Yeah, really well remembered. Yeah, I think I knew that I wanted to run an organization one day. I think that the reason for that is I'd often been in leadership roles, anything from when I was a teenager, I was mayor of a school's council that was between a number of schools. We sat in the actual council chamber in Hove Town Hall. I had an actual chain of office. And so some of the things that I got to do, I felt had sort of prepared me and given me the sort of inclination that would be something I'd want to try one day. But I didn't have any sort of timeline in mind or anything like that. And I suppose maybe I thought it would have been fulfilled by running my own organization, not necessarily going into somebody else's an existing one, but it was definitely a goal of mine to run something. Yeah.
And how was it to do that?
It was a lot of responsibility. It was amazing. It was a charity that I really believed in the cause, because essentially it supported other small charities. And so I suppose it does a lot of what I like to do, where helping good people to do things even better, or helping good people to keep going, or to feel encouraged, or to feel they have support. So it really fit together with that. I had some absolutely amazing experiences as part of the role. It was a steep learning curve, definitely. And it's really interesting to sort of evaluate it with hindsight. And I left in circumstances that weren't the greatest, because essentially there was a crunch point with our cash flow. And so we had some major sort of multi-annual funders, as I recall, and there's a crunch point with that. And because certain funding was pulled at the time when the other funding perhaps hadn't quite been secured, or we didn't quite have enough lined up, it couldn't support the charity. A small charity couldn't support my salary ongoing, so I stepped down. But that was a really interesting experience in itself, because I didn't feel that I stepped away in shame. I felt that I stepped away with my head held high. Um, I liked the board of trustees and we generally got on, etc. But the whole thing was a fantastic learning curve.
Mm. Yeah, and so then what happened next? Like, we've already hinted that it wasn't that you then were like, do you know that thing that Ian did with me? I should do that for some of my work.
No.
That wasn't what happened. So what happened next? I mean, you sound you sound very grounded about that, but I imagine there was some stress and tension to be leaving a job that, even though it made sense to you because you knew how charities worked, and in a way, if you work in a charity sector job, I mean, it's the same. It's just a different set of tensions to a private sector job. There's a set of circumstances under which no one's job is safe, and one of those in the charity sector is if the funding doesn't add up for a while. And it's one of the stressful things. If you talk to a lot of charity leaders, you know, it's like, I've got to get this funding, or these people who have jobs won't have jobs. So it's like a high pressure thing. It's why charity leaders spend so much time of their time on funding, is because that's partly how it works. So it must have been stressful. But what happened next? How did that phase shift into the next one?
Be honest with you, and I don't think this is something I've probably admitted publicly before, but I think there was a slight sense of relief at the same time. So I think for me, as I always feel, as long as I've done my best job with something, I feel okay about it. And because I left with my head held high, I felt okay about it. I also think that probably through that role, I think of myself more as a leader than a manager. There's various things around management that just don't inherently interest me. I can do them, but I particularly enjoy being a figurehead, crusading on a particular cause, that sort of thing. And of course, any job, especially one at a small charity, you have to be hands-on with a variety of different things. So there were some aspects of the job that I probably didn't feel the best at. Over time, I think I'd have got to grips with it. And it was definitely a real shock in terms of when I thought of my future and what I wanted to do in the sector. I'd imagined I'd build the organization up, maybe be chief executive of a bigger charity. But the other lovely thing was that because I'd built up my profile through that role and through Young Charity Trustees, I essentially got 2 sort of part-time job offers for other really exciting things during that time. So it wasn't that I was too long without something to properly get into, which probably made me feel a lot better. If I hadn't had that, I might have been terrified, to be fair.
And what was it? So what were those jobs, and how did that then lead to influence?
So one job was basically that I was supporting a network of charity leaders. So it was meetups for charity leaders around particular topics. And that was spun out of a business, a sort of business networking and support organization. So that was a new string to my bow, or learning about something new. And then the other, which sadly didn't fully get off the ground, it started, and then the funding ran through, which often can happen with social enterprisey good things. But it was amazing. It was basically in Manchester, an organization that was a recruitment agency set up a portal to link businesses with people who work for businesses with volunteering opportunities. And so they set up their own portal, and I was like the lead person on that project. We had a big launch in Manchester Cathedral, very, very exciting. But then the agency ended up having to close. All the people, I think, went on to great things, but that got that funding pulled. But what was brilliant about that was, firstly, it was lovely to work in the Northern Quarter in Manchester. When I went there a few times, I often worked from home. but also it gave me the chance to work with different types of organizations. Although it was in and around the charity sector and social good, it wasn't exclusively charities. And I think that gave me some much broader insights into a lot of things.
Yeah, and social good is a phrase that really I feel like I learned from you. I'm sure you didn't, maybe you didn't come up with it, maybe you did, I don't know, but it definitely felt like that wasn't a phrase that I was aware of, I don't think. And now if people hit your website, the Alex Swale website, there's this whole section on it which sums up some of the things you did under that, or do, or have done under that heading. So what, I guess there's two things. So for me, there's then like we before we get to coaching, we have to hit the influence expert somehow. Is that what happened next? And if so, how? Or were there other things moving around in your life at that time that are important in your journey?
I think for me, I basically been thinking about all these different experiences I'd had given me a more of an understanding of the direction I wanted to go in my career. And probably like most people, I'm still working it out. I'm not the finished article knowing everything that I want to do. But some clarity had come. I'd originally thought I wanted to go into politics, which is why I was an intern. And then I also did an international relations master's, so that had informed my view of the world as well. But essentially, these ideas were coalescing around, there was something around influence. And I term them the golden threads, which ran through the things I'd done up to that point. And the reason why I actually came up with the idea of influence and everything is I had breakfast in King's Cross Station with a very prominent charity chief executive of one of the bigger charities, an amazing guy. And he basically, through my discussion with him, it wasn't a coaching session, but it emerged that what I'm really interested in, or what I have been interested in, is influence, which we can go on to explain. But that gave me the idea to look further into influence and then work with people around the idea of influence.
And do you remember why the word, I mean, it kind of makes sense. I can kind of, if we can, people listening probably hear it, echoes of it now in the things you said, but do you remember where that word came from and why that word was the one that resonated?
I think it was just because when I look back at the things I'd done in my career up to that point, it all had influence, was the golden thread in a way that ran through everything. So, for example, my work with members of parliament, often the constituents who phoned up would have a low level of influence, but they'd piggyback on the MP's influence. So, for example, if I phoned the council on behalf of the MP, then people would be interested. I remember like just being put through to someone quite senior just because I said I'm from the MP's office. The people from the National Benevolent Fund for the Aged, I remember examples of where people just lacked influence and agency. And a lot of what the work was about was giving it back. So I remember I was supporting one of the breaks away. I was working in a hotel, supporting the people on the holiday. And somebody came up to me near the front desk and asked, could I have some more tea bags or something simple for their room? And rather than just asking at the front desk and getting it to them, I said, why don't you go and ask? And I'll be here, just come back to me if they don't. And I knew obviously they would. And I saw that that person in that moment didn't have very much influence. But of course, they went to the desk, they were given whatever they wanted. And in that small interaction, they had the chance to feel that they had influence and power that had probably been taken away from them by all sorts of horrible things that had happened to them in their life, unfair things. And then from my work with getting young people on boards and from my work supporting small charities, I saw that influence and people's ability to influence was at the heart of so many of the things that make the world go round. I mean, some people perhaps have more power than others.
Yeah, and in reading some of your book, there's some great bits in there about sometimes people have influence and they kind of speak too much. I mean, shouldn't, or they don't use it well, and influence gets kind of bad name. I want to ask more about it, but I just think you've described this like maybe it happened in that conversation with that chief exec, maybe it was just the thinking you were doing, but it's an incredible piece of work to invite people to do. You know, I kind of did my version of it when I was working out what the heck am I doing, when, you know, when I kind of fell out of love in some ways with the arts and the charity sector. And I did it through a career shifters blog that they had, but it was essentially the same exercise. It's like, what, like the things that I've loved doing the most or been in flow doing the most over the last decade of my work, like what do they have in common? And that's a cool exercise to do for coaches, although probably for most coaches listening, the key thread will be something to do with people in the way that yours is, albeit it's with your flavor and mine is with my flavor. But it's also a cool exercise to do with clients. Okay, so there's this sense of influence. And then what I just remember is like, there's a very bold thing about branding yourself the influence expert. Like that's a move that I want to hear about. But also like you just, and then there was a load of work that you did around LinkedIn, but also social media, which is shown by the, you know, like I checked it because I was like, I know he has like loads of followers. For me, like in the grand scheme of things, you know, compared to Lionel Messi or whatever, not that many, but 15,000 followers on LinkedIn and 14,000 on Twitter. That's something happening, you know, there. So talk me through getting to the place where you were willing and able to say, I am the influence expert. And then what happened around that? Like, what are your favorite, not that that's over, but what are your favorite parts of that influence journey?
Yeah, the influence expert is a bit, I think over time I've just realized that there's nothing wrong with being bold about these sort of statements. And there's quite a lot of, you notice it a lot when people are perhaps moving to a new career. So for example, it took me a long time before I called myself a coach. And I think, and this might be something that sort of resonates with the listeners, is at what point do you actually call yourself a coach, not an aspiring coach or someone interested about coaching? And as we'll go on to discover, like I don't have lots of clients at the moment. I still haven't done a great deal of coaching, but I call myself a coach. And why do I do that? And why didn't I do that at one point? So there's a sort of continuum with influence. I think that my feeling was that there weren't lots of people doing the work that I was doing. So there were people who were, and always will be, much greater influence, experts in influence in the academic sense. So if anyone's interested, Robert Cialdini, who I'd heard of years and years before, there's lots of people who do great things, but it was people who kind of relate that to more to like business practice and more to people building what they do in the world. So there's a guy called Daniel Priestley who very much does that, but there's not loads and loads of people, I think, who do that, though more now. And just to address as well what you said about influence and people essentially having negative influence in the world, is that firstly, I think influence itself is neither positive or negative, because there's all sorts of people, history littered with people who influence in a terrible way. So influence itself is basically neutral. It's people can use it for good or ill. And the thing that I think has given influence and personal branding, which my work also covers, a bad name, is partly around the idea of the influencer being quite a narrow subsection of people who influence people, say, to buy particular products. But when I think of influence, it's so much broader than that. It could literally be the influence people have over their own family, or the influence people have in their community, or even the influence that people have over themselves, and also how they understand how the world influences them through advertising, politics, culture. So influence is very broad, and not that narrow subsection of influencers that I think the media tends to focus on a lot more.
Yeah, the way you talked about influence is neither positive nor negative, it made me think of like my journey with money as a thing. You know, being money is another thing that lots of people, including me, used to have this like what looks to me just now like a truly insane, distorted view of the world, which is that money is somehow bad. It's like you can only have money if you're greedy, or whatever the weird stories are that I used to have. And it does feel like I can get that echo. Like there are this set of things that lots of us have a kind of story about them being bad. You named influence and personal branding. I've just named money. Sales is definitely one. It's like there's a whole set of things. Like, I don't know if you have a thought on this, but what do you think that is about?
Oh, it's different. I think if I had to guess, it would be that a lot of it is around people want to say, I'm not like that. So sales being the obvious one. It's like sales, people spring to mind. It's like a used car salesman. Now that springs to my mind. I've never bought a car and I can't drive. So I have no experience of the only used car salesman that I feel I have any experience of is in Matilda. Wasn't Matilda's dad a used car salesman? So I remember him with like this really dirty moustache and this like filthy old jacket.
Yeah,
or something.
there's one in The Simpsons, isn't there, called Gil? I've just remembered, who I haven't thought about for a long time, who is like them taking the mick out of that story. So in a way, what you're saying is there's like, it's a great example because you've never bought a car, so you don't have any first-hand experience of that. So maybe what you're saying is we just have this like societal archetype, perhaps particularly in England, I don't know, particularly in Britain, that those things have a kind of like grotty side to them, and therefore I don't want to be like that, and therefore I'll avoid the thing altogether. It's weird that personal branding, you're absolutely right, like you're like, to name that as a thing, and influence, they do have that as well. That's a bit harder to work out because they're newer, whereas the sales thing or the money thing, they're kind of older, they feel older ideas, and that story's been around longer. I don't know.
I think the fact that you use the word story is really instructive, because this is like an narrative around perhaps things like in being inauthentic. Because what I think people don't like about the sales of the sleazy car salesman is that it's inauthentic.
Well,
What
or the
people don't like about
personal brand, right?
Exactly. Personal brand, people would see it as inauthentic. Influences inauthentic, that they're endorsing a product in order to sell the product rather than they actually like the product. So I think even with money, people see, for whatever reason, they label people getting money as inauthentic, as in they just want to get money and don't care about people. But what I think we've probably both learned in recent years is that you can really dissect the story about money and tell an entirely different story. But for some reason, we live in a capitalist society that tells strangely negative stories about money, which I don't really understand why that would be the case.
Yeah, that is weird, isn't it? A society based entirely around money. And you can say that there are bad things about that. I don't think I necessarily believe that. Like, again, I think money is just a pretty neutral thing, really. But that where we have a story that that only bad people have it. Again, I think there is that echo with influence, isn't there? I think partly, and yeah, in some of the bits of your book that I was skipping through last night, like you kind of name this, or you hint at it, I think. A bit like money and influence, there are like, one of the problems with them is there are people that have them that from the outside, it feels natural to assume don't deserve them. And so there's this like, I think that's quite a fairness and proportionality are kind of quite deep human things. That I'm really interested in the work of Jonathan Haidt's work. Jonathan Haidt, who's a moral psychologist, and he has fairness as one of the moral taste buds that humans basically all have. So maybe it's that. Maybe like we've got this story because there definitely are and have been, but still are, people who speech marks don't deserve it. Although who am I to judge that? Really would be where my personal growth has taken me with that, which definitely wasn't 15 years ago. I would have absolutely made that judgment. Maybe it's got something to do with that as well.
Yeah, I think it has, but also I think there's, relating almost to the money side of it, is that one of the parts of my story, which is almost between or during the influence expert bit, was that my wife and I went to live in other countries quite a lot. And I think that
How many countries have you lived in, Alex?
I think I've lived in more than 10. So ranging from just over a month, but it wasn't a holiday, we're working, to obviously most of my life in the UK, 2 years in Japan, about 6 months in Romania. But there's this thing, which again, a lot of people listening to the podcast may know, but if you don't, it's interesting to look at, which is around people being digital nomads and location independent. And my wife and I actually run a group for digital nomads on LinkedIn. And one of the things that I found when I was traveling is, firstly, any type of travel, especially living overseas, shows you there's lots of different ways to live, which are presented as legitimate, at least in that culture that you happen to be traveling through or living in for a bit. But secondly, one thing that I sort of realized is that the UK is a pretty expensive country, and London's pretty expensive. And I think I really sort of resent the idea that I need to bring in a decent amount of money just to stand still. So it's like just to have a basic standard of living. So I've just read something in the Metro the other day, which was something like, it was looking at different cities and saying, what's the income that you need to be happy in each of these cities? And in London, it was 79,000, 70 something thousand, I don't know. And then like in Brighton, Cambridge, Oxford, a few other places, it was like over 70. But even the one it went down to least of the major cities was like 62,000. But the thing was, it said, even the article said, this is quite a sad fact, because it said that only that's 10%, that's only the top 10% of people earn that amount. And yet to have a standard of living to be happy by whatever calculation was that you needed that much. And I'm just like, wow, like that feels like a treadmill that I want to get off of. Yeah. And by traveling, I got off of it at various points.
Yeah, I'm not sure I quite buy it. I get the feel of it, but you know, like when me and Emma lived in London, we had some very happy times, and between us, we were not earning an average of 70 grand. But I get it, and it's a great, like, again, it's kind of being willing to step off the treadmill. I guess in some ways, Alex, that's like a thing that feels like a part of you and your story, because I found this in your book, which is, so Alex's book is called How to Become an Influencer, and you can get it on Amazon and all that kind of all those kind of places. And again, Alex is an influence on me by virtue of doing that kind of thing. You know, it wasn't the only person that I knew who had published books, but like, you know, that is not a small thing. And you, like, I'm going to read some quotes that you put in here about you. You say, to give you the example of the sector in which I successfully grew my influence, the charity sector, here are some things people said about me. A leading charity sector publication, Alexander Swallow is what would commonly be described as a rising star in the charity sector. Chief exec of a charity, if he is the future of the charity sector, we are in good hands. Somebody else said, Alex is rapidly becoming one of the nation's great champions of the non-profit sector. So it's like, one of the questions I wanted to ask you, and I'm crowbarring it in here at this strange time, is because it feels like you got off the charity sector treadmill really at some point in this time since leaving that job. And like, that's quite a thing to leave behind, people saying that kind of thing about you. Now, of course, you've taken that with you because you've taken you with you, but you also haven't taken it all with you. And I'm wondering what your reflections are on that.
I think firstly, I still do some things in and around the charity sector. So I still work with sort of more broadly social good organizations, and I'm an associate for an organization that supports people with governance. But I think I realized once I got out of the charity sector, once I wasn't exclusively working in the charity sector, I realized in some ways what a small pond it was. So a bit like when you leave university. And it employs a lot of people, but the charity sector can act, I think, in quite a cliquey way in all sorts of ways. And I perhaps noticed that a bit more because I was doing things around board diversity. But I even noticed it with things like, I'm not sure what class I define myself as now, but I'd say my background is pretty working class. And I remember being at a meeting of charity leaders where somebody said, oh, aren't we also middle class? And I thought, wait a minute, no, not really. And so for me, I think that I realized that the charity sector, though it does great things, doesn't have a monopoly on good. And I'd never been a person who thought only the charity sector does good things, so like being anti-business.
Just to say, I had
Or,
definitely been a person who thought that, by the way. Like, I'm not embarrassed to
really?
admit it now. I absolutely believed that. Yeah, yeah. And it was a harmful belief to me in my interaction with the world, for sure. To do a long conversation sidebar about that if we want, but just wanted to catch that because it's like, I had definitely had that thought. It's partly why I didn't really try and work in the private sector immediately after university, whilst friends and even my girlfriend at the time were.
We dip
So
into that a bit, Robbie. Could we go there a
yeah,
little bit, just because there's been certain parallels in, our careers, things we've done, and we've had many discussions about the way we see the world, etc. And I'd love to just unpack that the tiniest bit, because I think it'll be useful for the listeners. But what was it, do you think? Where had that belief come from? Do you think? Do you know, or do you have a sense?
I mean, not really. Like, I think my dad, when I once sent him some writing that I'd done about this, which is not out anywhere actually, he was like laughing about, I can't believe we used to believe those silly things together. Like, so he might say it was partly from him. My mum and dad, they were kind of, my brother would call it like, he calls it like countercultural in the 70s. So they were part of, my dad lived in a commune for a while. My mum like gave up her PhD partway through because it felt like it was like, I'm exaggerating this a little bit, but like, it's the system. I've done the work. I don't need to like finish the PhD. So there was definitely that feel about them. And that's the kind of environment I grew up in. I didn't go to school until I was 9. So there's this sense that you don't have to do things that way. But I think it's a little like the things we were talking about influence and personal brand and money and sales. It had that same feel to me. Some of it might come, it's like a response to what people would see as the excesses of the kind of 80s free market stuff in the UK and the US. But really, I'm not, underneath what it makes me think in this moment, I mentioned Garvey Berger earlier. One of the things she says is that humans get trapped by simple stories in a complex world. Simple stories are very attractive. It's very easy. Like, I love stories of good and evil. So it's like life's easier if you've got a story of good and evil. Unfortunately, that's not how life actually is. But it's easier if I can, coming out of university, say, well, look, there's some good guys, and they look like the public sector and the charity sector, and some bad guys, which looks like business who pollute rivers and sell people stuff they don't want, and that kind of thing, and make loads of money for selfish rich people. And I'm not particularly proud of having had those stories pretty embedded in my worldview, but they were, and it took a whole bunch of things really to shake me out of that simple story, which, a bit like my dad, it's like, I know lots of people have, and I just caught myself then going, a bit like my dad, laugh at the stupid things I used to believe, and then caught myself realizing that there might be people listening who have those beliefs. And I don't want to like think that I'm laughing at them. I just, but it is funny to look back at a viewpoint, which to me, and just realize that I was not seeing, as soon as I changed that viewpoint, and there were a few things that helped me do that, I felt like I saw the world a lot more as it actually is, and a lot less like through some very simple stories.
Oh, that's fascinating. That's fascinating. Thank you, Robbie. Because, and also, I suppose that not only you're not laughing at the people who might hold that belief, but also we both, and the listeners too, hold belief right now that we'd have a chuckle about in 10 years or 20 years time, looking back now. Like, I've got so much more learning to do.
Yeah. And I should say, I'm not like, well, I'm a little attached to, I think I am right about that, but I might be wrong. Like, business might be evil in some way. Like, it would take quite because, for example, I know my business. I run a business. I'm 90, I can't be 100% sure, but I'm like 99.9% sure I'm not evil. But then probably, the evil people never think they're evil, right? That's part of the thing. But sorry, we're messing around a little bit here, but I think you make a good point there. And it's probably worth slowing down on, like, the shades of gray that exist then at that point, the things about which I am not certain, which are many, the excesses of Jonathan Haidt, who I mentioned before. The way he would talk, one of the ways he talks about capitalism is to try and integrate essentially the two. He has a cool lecture. Let's see if we can find it, about called like the three stories of capitalism. And essentially one is capitalism is the root of all evil. And the second one is, no, capitalism is the reason that, the world is so much better than it used to be. Fewer children die, fewer women die in childbirth. Everyone's richer. More people have access to what they need. Fewer people die of starvation every year. Those are the kind of two stories. And then he tries to do those are both too simple. So what's the integrated version? And one of the things he says is that, the integrated version, part of it is that capitalism is an incredible system for making things incredibly efficient. And that includes making exploitation incredibly efficient, so that you get some places where a kind of system which follows evolution in some kind of evolutionary function to it, like just evolves, and then you get disasters where factories collapse on workers, and you get all kinds of other things that we could talk about, but we probably shouldn't, because then that'll be a different episode of this podcast. Maybe we'll save some of this gold, Alex, where we're for round 2 sometime. But wait, sorry, we don't have to move on from this, because let's slow it down, because I've just put quite a lot into this conversation. It's funny, I had this thought partway through this conversation that I actually had this thought, I wonder if we'll have some weird little bit about, because we've talked about these things and you've explored some of the writing that I've written that you helped me with that isn't published, is about my journey with this. You actually know more about it than most people, probably anyone outside my family. Maybe there's a couple other people that read that book at the same time, actually, you and a few others. I wondered if we might get into this kind of thing. I'm wondering what you're hearing in this that's interesting, but also why is it important that we're having this conversation together now in the context of this conversation?
That's a beautiful catch, Robbie. I think for me, it's probably, the way I see it is that when I think about these things we're talking about, it's fundamentally about the type of coach I want to be, and beyond coaching, the way I want to show up as a professional in the world. And one important aspect here related to what we're saying is, I've definitely also had narratives around business being bad, and some businesses are bad, but frankly, some charities are bad and are set up for money laundering and all sorts. It's not completely clear cut all the time. But my fundamental politics, philosophy, everything is based around, firstly, that human beings are amazing. So I find it very difficult where I feel a lot of people continually criticize humanity. Humanity has got a lot wrong, but I think thinking like we've got a lot wrong isn't going to lead to good things. I think thinking we're flawed but do a lot right is going to lead to a better world. And secondly, and relatedly, I see life at the level of the individual all the time. So I'm a person who tends to shy away from groups, and maybe we'll go on to discuss a bit about how the coaching sector has been a bit of a different experience for me in that. But what it means when I see people at the level of the individual is, I can't believe that all the individuals who work for businesses, including big businesses, are terrible, and that all the individuals who work for charities are wonderful. It just doesn't make any sense to me, because individuals are so multifaceted and interesting, and most of us have good and bad points, that the idea that somehow, I don't know, the hand of capitalism would neatly divide all the good moral people over here. And what would the split be? Money, location, interest in work? How could we decide that all those people were good and all those people were bad? And it just doesn't work for me. I think the world's a lot more complicated than that.
Yeah, one of the things that makes me think of is I remember when at some point when I was starting out in coaching, it might have been on our coaching training, people were talking about this kind of ethical or moral decisions you might have to make as a coach. Like, is there anyone you wouldn't work with? And I remember people, and interestingly, what am I now, 8 years on? I'd say every kind of industry, it's not quite true. There's probably a couple that I haven't that people would name. But if you imagine all the industries that people might name to say, I wouldn't coach somebody in that industry because it speech marks evil, I've coached somebody in that industry by now. And there's one that I'll never forget. I don't think I can really do it. It's a bit, if I name the industry, it's a little too close on the confidentiality, but for various reasons. But if you imagine what people might say as the industries, one of those like three or four or five that people would name remains one of the most, like, when I think of her now, I get this like warm feeling in my heart. Like I'm literally getting that now, because that was what this woman was like. Like it was the most joyous, wonderful 45 minutes of my week for about a year in total. And this woman works in one of these industries. So it's like, what do you do with that, right? That's not a simple story.
That's beautiful. Thanks for sharing that, Rob.
Yeah. So, Alex, I want to get to coaching soon, because we're not really talking about it yet. And I think that's okay, because listeners are going to have plenty of time to get to know you and your journey as you interview some amazing people on the show. But I do want to get to it. Before we do that, like, tell me 1, 2, 3 of your favorite things from the time when the influence expert was the focus of your work. Like, what really stands out for you?
I think one of the most wonderful for me has actually happened in the past year, which I did some work at the Eden Project in Cornwall, and that was like dream client, fascinating people. I worked with a team of their senior leaders, doing a couple of days with them and doing some one-to-ones with them, and it was just beautiful around, because even just being in the environment, I had actually visited once before and really liked the Eden Project, but the values was such a fit for me. It was a perfect example of people who in their own fields were more brilliant than me in every way, but by talking to them, and just as importantly, by giving them a space to think and to talk to each other, it was beautiful, the things that we discussed and worked on together. And I think for me, it's quite often that was a really good reminder, perhaps, that quite often in coaching, this is one of the reasons I like coaching, is opening up the space for people, which might be an away day or a pocket of time in a one-to-one, for people to do the work themselves and to be taken out of the everyday busyness is just such a gift to people, and I think it was beautiful because the people involved in that really took that on as a gift and really ran with it. But it's like those people have those things within themselves, and you can set it up and in the main get out of the way because they know what they're doing. But without your intervention, or without your intervention being their coach, they might not have had that.
Yeah, beautifully put. Anything else that really stands out? I could ask a million more questions about that, Alex, and I'd love to if we had more time, but anything else that stands out from your work on influence?
I think the thing I was most proud of was writing the book. And you're a good person to talk to about this thing, as you've written a series of books and help other people to get their creative work out into the world.
And if Alex's name is familiar to you, it might be from him writing nice things in the front, or sometimes on the cover of, or back cover of one of my books. If you don't know what I'm talking about, then I'll disown you, because you obviously haven't bought my books yet. So go and do that. Sorry, Alex, carry on.
I think for me, Robbie, it was a bit like, I think it, and again, I think it's something really worth people listening to this to reflect on, is where people have a goal, what's the minimum fulfillment of that goal? So for example, I could have said 10 years ago or 15 years ago, I wanted to lead an organization and I wanted to write a book. And if somebody had said to me, what would that look like? I would have probably said a big organization, something around social good. And I would have said a book that was available in bookshops and maybe was prominently in the window or won an award or something. Now, it actually turned out that being the chief executive of a small organization fulfilled that for me. And self-publishing a book, which actually on my website is free for people to download an electronic copy, that was enough for me. I wanted to feel that I had the discipline perhaps to write a book, and my grandfather who died in the past year, I wanted to be able to get my book in his hands. I wanted to be able to do that, and he ended up living a lot more because he lived in his mid-90s. That was a motivating factor for me, and so I think that is really interesting. I find it really interesting to consider with other ambitions that I might have. What's almost like the minimal viable product that would make me feel satisfied in all these areas that I want to be satisfied. And they could be things around health and relationships as well. I'm not saying I want to give my wife a bit of a viable product to me, but there might be things where I'm like, that's good enough in various aspects of my life. And the book was kind of, I was so happy and satisfied that I completed that.
Yeah, I love that, and it really resonates in my life. And what a cool thing to ask coaching clients as well, right? Like, you think that we have this story about what it'll take to fulfill that goal, and I think it's really common that it requires something quite different to fulfill the spirit of the goal, to how we might originally describe it, and to try and get people, of course, it's like in some ways it took courage from you, though. Again, it's that like I can't remember what you called it before, the metaphor for going away, getting out of the charity sector, off that runway, off the
treadmill,
it's like, exactly, it's that same thing of you again, because we all have know stories of people who realize that much later, right? Who spend time pursuing leadership in the charity sector, say, until they're 55, and then realize that actually they haven't really wanted that on some level for a long time, and that what they really wanted was kind of captured much earlier. So I think it's a really beautiful thing that you just described there. Alex, take us to then. It's taken us a long time to get back here, but I'm really glad we've taken this kind of journey through the work you've done. And there's so much more we haven't really touched on. You have a free, is it still free, networking online course that people can do if they hate networking or want tips on that? There's like a million, again, in the research prep for this conversation, there's just a million, so much content that Alex has made over the years that, like, again, there's like, I found a video that I definitely watched before about 5 reasons to not work in the charity sector, which I completely obviously forgotten existed because I've seen like a million videos and articles from Alex since then. You're on like probably nearly 400 weeks of a weekly newsletter now, aren't you? Something like that. People can sign up for that on your website.
Exactly. Yeah.
There's like, so much like amazing content about LinkedIn that, again, if people go to, I think it's mostly on the Influence Expert website, or you can find your way to it. So there's all that we're not going to get into more today, probably, because I want to get to coaching. So I can fill in some of the gaps, right? I know that you've trained as a coach now, done some training, but I also know from knowing you for a long time that you've been coaching probably since before you even met Ian. If you go back to your book, Alex, I don't know if you know this, but it's just full of coaching exercises and questions. It's like all of the, it's been there a long time, but you've done that formal training now. And it's now you're calling yourself a coach, like you said. What was it that catalyzed that shift? The move towards it, the training, the kind of rebranding of yourself, or the emphasis on coaching now?
Yeah, I think so. I think there's 2 ways to answer that question. The first is I feel confident that I feel more confident about saying I'm a coach now because I've done the training. So I did training with Barefoot, and I've done some extra training with Empower World. So I feel like I've done some of that. I've done practice as a coach. I've had one very long-term client, so I've been practicing over time. But I think that a lot of it was really around the community created with his podcast, which was something I wanted to make sure that I got to mention, because I think, when I first became a member of the Coach's Journey community, I'm not sure I was very confident I was a coach. In fact, I think I remember saying to you, my reticence about joining is that it won't be of value for the other people for me being there because I'm not really a coach yet. And so I think for me, a lot of it was just having that reassurance from others as part of a community, but I am indeed a coach.
Yeah. And just as a little aside, when people get worried about, if you have it's always worth saying when you catch an example of this, people are worried that, like, if you have a niche, that it'll like put people off in some way. So we have me very clearly branding up a community as for coaches, and we have Alex, who really doesn't think he's a coach, and he's still asked about it, right? So it's like for the people for whom it is for, they'll still come to you. Rich Litvin has a story about a man called Simon who kept asking to join Rich's Confident Women group program. And it's like, Simon was like, it wouldn't take no for an answer. And in the end, I think they did some different work together. But it's like, if people really care, they'll do that. Alex, to again, just really challenge that you are not a coach. In your book, there's a testimonial from a guy called Ryan Pryor. And one of the things he says at the end of it is, I can recommend his coaching services. So the book was published in 2016. So like, even like Ryan knew that you were a coach. And
that's fascinating, because I wouldn't have called myself a coach back then, or at least I hope I did.
And when we had that conversation in a pub in Sheffield, which is where we had that conversation, I'm 99% sure. I remember being not quite sure when I first asked it, but I was like, pretty sure what I said. What I remember is, you feel like a coach, and to me, it feels like you've always been a coach. And what I asked was, are you doing any coaching, or have you? And as soon as you said yes, some, like a bit, not much, but some, even though you hadn't done a kind of full coaching training by that point, although you'd done some workshops here and there, and the work with Ian and the leadership programs, and a million other relevant things, that felt to me like, oh yeah, no, that's like, Alex is in this in some way. And what I remember about that as well was that it was a little surprising to me that you'd listened to so much of the podcast up to that point. I can't remember when it was, pre-pandemic, so the podcast wouldn't have been that old. It was probably like spring 2020, actually, wasn't it, that we met up in Sheffield that time. So really just before the world went weird. So the podcast would have only been 8 or 10 episodes old. So for some reason you've been listening to it, and it makes sense in this conversation because of all the reasons we've said why coaching makes sense as part of your journey. But yeah, like that's what I remember. And yeah, and so then, like, it's been beautiful to have you as part of the community over these, whatever it is, 3 years, and to see this journey. And I'm super glad. It's been like one of my favorite things has been seeing your LinkedIn presence. What I think I've seen, this is one of the reasons I'm really glad you're in the coaching world, is you doing on LinkedIn and social media what you used to do on those platforms for the charity sector, but in the coaching sector. And it's just such as all those people who wrote those amazing things about you in the charity sector, like, they were right. You could, if your goals had been different, you could have absolutely done those things that those people said that I read out before. And it's the coaching sector's gain that you're not doing that. Because I can see you connecting people and connecting with people and sharing things. And, and like, excitingly, there's a book coming, and it's like all these things, everything you've learned, I can kind of see the coaching sector reaping the benefits of that. But like, what feels important to you in this moment to say, and I'd love to get to the book in a few minutes, but if we think about this journey into coaching, maybe you could share a little bit for the listeners, because I think one of the things about, again, people can listen back to episode 56 to learn more about why there is now a team of hosts and all that kind of thing. But one of the reasons it's meaningful for me is that going back to board diversity, in some ways, the diversity of the hosts is different. The questions that get asked are different, because it's not just me, it's different people at different stages of their journey as a coach, getting to ask questions of, again, different people at different stages of their journeys as coaches. So maybe, if you're up for it, to say something about like where you are with coaching now, how you feel about it, and how it fits in with the work that you're doing, which, like you say, some of it is still really influence expert work, even though that was always coaching work anyway, and coaching is going to be influence work anyway, and all that kind of thing.
That's okay. I mean, I must say, and I think this is almost been an example of coaching on this call, that you brought home to me more than was front of mind, for me at least, how some of the work I've done in the past was more coaching work. And even that quote, I hadn't remembered that being said in that quote. So I think the way that our journey feed into where we are now is really useful to reflect back and look at those things. In terms of where I am now, I think I've been spending quite a lot of time learning from other coaches about how they build their businesses, learning from other coaches about the type of coaching there is out there, because I think a lot of people who listen to the podcast will get it just from the variety of the guests, but there are so many different ways to do coaching. And that includes types of coaching, but also some people are coaches and consultants. Some people only do coaching. Some people are coaches as embedded in an organization, or an associate coach, or they only have private clients, or only do group coaching. There's so much involved. So part of it has me been learning the smorgasbord of things out there, and then trying to understand how I might usefully fit into that in two ways. The first one is what contribution I can most usefully make to the world. And the way I answer that question is, I'm always going to be a person who wants to get my work out to a large group of people. So I'm never going to be a person who's going to exclusively center my work working one-to-one. Like, my ambitions are always that I want to reach out to people. So that's part of it. It's also part of it working out where I can be of most value. So I think that going forward, coaching and consulting together works, because sometimes I want to advise people about things about influence and personal branding. And sometimes I want to do pure coaching and hold the space with people and for them to come up with their solutions. So I need to do both of those things. And then the second major piece is finding something that works for me financially. So, when I look at my ambitions for the future, and particularly, although I'm settled in Sheffield at the moment, I'd always like to have something that I could do overseas. And because I've worked overseas before online, and so has my wife, I thought a lot about that type of thing. How is that sustainable? And so coaching can be great for that, because like right now you can have conversations online and not have to be in the same physical space. But where I am right now is I'm trying, not always successfully, to be at peace with the fact that I'm not moving at a very, very fast pace, that I'm kind of settled in what it is that I'm working out and working towards. But I feel that there's going to be a more section of doing. I've been doing a lot of thinking, and I think perhaps in the next year, there's going to be quite a lot more doing of taking things forward. And the book you mentioned is one of those things.
Yeah, nice. And you have said that to me before about thinking and doing, but it was interesting because one of the questions I had for you was like, I'd forgotten you'd said that. Maybe it was subliminally planted, like like the trips for elderly people. But I was thinking, it feels like there've been phases of really, like, for want of a better word, loud on the internet, Alex, and really quiet on the internet, Alex. And we're in a quiet period now. And I was kind of, I think some people might have heard me tell the story, like that article when you wrote 100 articles on LinkedIn. If you don't mind me saying this, I use Alex as an example
Hilarious.
of the hare
You love
versus the
this
tortoise,
story.
right? I do. But it was like, because for me, this is a huge, I can't like describe what a big deal this is for me. It was you and my brother, particularly. I remember when I was starting out into coaching, had just both written a huge number of blogs. At some point, one of those huge number was the 100th LinkedIn blog. And it just felt like I don't think I ever thought actively it's an impossible thing for me to write 100 blogs, or I'll definitely never have written more blogs than Alex. But it was just I didn't have a writing practice, and I couldn't, it felt inconceivable to me at that time that one day I would realize I've written more blogs than Alex, at least on LinkedIn, and more articles than my brother. And and I sometimes use one of the other as the example of the hare versus the tortoise when I want to get home to people that writing one thing a week is a worthwhile thing to do. You don't have to rush. But in a way, Alex, that brings us to that thing you just said, which I just think is a very interesting, valuable thing to think about, which is you being at peace with moving slowly. I didn't mean to get to there by telling the tortoise hare story, but like, why do you think that's important for you to be at peace with moving at a slow, speech mark, slow pace, whatever that means?
Again, I think two reasons. The first one is that I've always had a sort of restless ambition, that a lot of my work on myself has been around trying to understand that. I've always pushed myself in lots of ways. So I mentioned about doing the student leadershipy type things. So I was the first person in my immediate family to go to university, and then that university was Cambridge. And then at Cambridge, I was student union president of my college. So I kind of push myself and take myself outside my comfort zone in loads of different ways. And I think what I'm trying to learn over time to be gentle with myself is, firstly, that it's a very long race. Like, it's, I don't have to think about this in short moments of time. So that just being confident that I'll get to where I want to get to, and the pace doesn't necessarily matter so much, is a sort of something I've learned with age. And then the second thing really is that I think that some of the things around coaching just do take a lot of time to learn. So they're not like, they can be some industries where you can do perhaps a pretty good job of things pretty early on. But I think a lot about coaching is about experience. So I've been doing a lot of the side of the learning from other coaches, the building the business, the coaching approaches, the more sort of almost academic, philosophical side of things, which has been really important as a foundation. And now I just need to do more coaching. And doing that more coaching, I can't snap my fingers and do it. Like if we said the difference between my coaching practice and yours, and we took all the other things we've done and we just said the hours we'd each done, that is a significant amount of work that simply can't be rushed if I want to be a good coach. And so that's why I also think I'm perhaps a bit gentle with myself about it.
Yeah. Yeah, I think it's beautifully put where you'd say, look, I would, there are ways, it's worth saying to people for listening, there are ways to do more coaching. Like if you've identified that. So it's not, I don't think you're saying that, you're just saying that that's the next move, right? The next move is to, it is possible to do more coaching, for example, and that's the next move. Is that right?
That's the next move, but also because the feeling of it can't be rushed. So for example, I could write an ebook in the next week, and it might not be a very good one, but I could do it, and it would be a thing that would be out there, and it would in some way be complete. But I feel like I'm echoing the title of this podcast, but this is a journey. This isn't like something where I'm just going to be, I'm at the destination. Like I'm not sure when I'll consider myself a good coach according to my own standards. Like I think I'm a good consultant, and I think I'm good at personal branding, but how long that journey will take me to be a good coach, I don't know. And that, by the way, of course, doesn't mean I think I'm a bad coach. I think I already do good work with people, but because it's a journey, it's something that I want to be growing into. And I know some aspects of that will just take time to practice and get better and learn.
Yeah, lovely. Alex, we're coming towards the end of our time. I'm curious if you were to bring, let's talk about the book in a minute, but first, if you were to bring that lens of influence to, maybe this leads into the book, I don't know, to, I guess in two ways I'm interested in asking this question, to the coaching industry, like what could the coaching industry do better when it comes to influence? And then what are the particular things that you see with individual coaches that coaches could do better with when it comes to influence?
The first one's huge, and not something I've hugely thought of. So I'll tackle the second one first. So in terms of what I think people should do, a lot of it is really around just thinking about how you come across to other people and how you want to come across to other people and what the gap is between those things. So many coaches are freelancers, and as such, we don't tend to get a lot of feedback. So one of the great things about being part of a community of coaches like this one around the podcast, is being able to get feedback and to learn from each other. So I think it's really important to get feedback on how you come across, if you want to have a niche, how you communicate that. It's really important for you to also be experimental in terms of what really floats your boat, what you're interested in, what you're good at, what do clients want. So I think having that sort of spirit of inquiry is really, really important. But finally, I think for individuals, it's around thinking, if you believe you're doing good work, and hopefully everybody involved in coaching does, it's not bad to shout about it. It's like, you are the best you, is the way I would think of it. You will be, even as a new coach starting off, you will be the ideal client for somebody out there. You could take the most experienced coach in the world, and they wouldn't be the best coach for everybody, and you might be. And that might be because somebody wants somebody at a certain level in relation to them, or maybe they want somebody who has an understanding of their culture, or they want someone who has a background in an industry, and your industry is quite niche. So just being confident that you have something to offer that people want will then inform all the ways in which you present yourself authentically.
Yeah.
So
lovely.
The first question, in terms of the influence of the coaching industry, I think it's a very difficult question to answer, because on the one hand, I really like the professionalism of the coaching industry. I really like the fact that it's not so much the Wild West anymore. There's accrediting bodies, there's organizations. But on the other hand, I think it's a bit of a shame if the kind of multiplicity of approach is lost. So I think there needs to be an umbrella, but it needs to be a pretty big umbrella. Like the beauty of the differentials between different coaches showing up as real human beings means that everyone's approach isn't going to be the same. And to have an influence on the world as coaches as we want, I think allowing for a flavor of that individuality is also going to be really important.
Yeah. Lovely. Again, like not a simple story, right? It's like a complex thing. Alex, I loved getting an email from your mailing list a few weeks ago saying, I'm writing another book. And I was like, what? How do I not know about this? And then it's a book about coaching. Tell us about this book.
It's nice for me to mention, as well as the Coach's Journey community. Another really important community to me is called the Sheffield Coaching Exchange. And essentially what it's about is the Sheffield Coaches Exchange is around bringing local people together. We have talks, I've done some talks, and learning from each other and having that sense of community. And that sense of community I've really loved in the coaching sector as compared to even the charity sector, for example.
Yeah, just maybe, can you say something more about that, Alex? Like what something's different there? And I know you've kind of mentioned, or we talked before about you feeling like a lone wolf, or like somebody who kind of is private in certain ways. I mean, you kind of mentioned it before, until you're not, and these kind of things. What is it? What's different, or what have you noticed about community or groups in the coaching sector?
I think the big difference for me is that it doesn't feel competitive. So I found the charity sector disappointingly competitive. Like I thought the charity sector was going to be amazingly collaborative. But I found, for example, a lot of big charities didn't really care what small charities were doing. They had their own higher level things to worry about. Whereas for me, I was always interested in a cause, not the charity. I didn't even care. Like I didn't care particularly about the charity I worked for. I cared about the cause we were all working towards. And I feel that coaching, perhaps as a discipline, is something that coaches care about in a way that being charitable and giving is not something that all people in charities, in my experience, cared about. They cared about their particular bit. And obviously, there's huge counterexamples of people caring beyond their particular bit. But coaches seem particularly generous in supporting each other in a non-competitive way. And while I found my own pockets of people doing that in the charity sector, I feel that in the coaching sector that I've just found a lot more of that. And so I found that it's actually, so to give this example of the book, there's a brilliant lady, brilliant coaching professional who's a very experienced coach who also studied was trained by Barefoot. Her name's Danielle Barbaro. And she gave a talk at the Sheffield Coaching Exchange. And it was about how she developed her practice. And she works as a divorce coach. And she gets people recommended to her, clients recommended to her by divorce lawyers. So she's got this terrific win-win-win example where she helps the clients, which is supportive to the lawyers who refer more clients to her, and she loves the work and she's brilliant at it. And I just said to her afterwards, I sent her a message and said, this is amazing, more people should know about it. And it's turned out we're going to write a book about it. So it's basically a book, it's explaining one method of getting clients where you set it up as a win for all concerned and you get a series of coaching referrals over time. And that's the only way that she gets clients is through these referrals. And so for me, it's brilliant. I get to collaborate with a coach who inspires me and who is much more experienced than me. I get to share about coaching and I hopefully get to increase my profile a bit in the coaching industry. And I think it will really help people, which I'm very excited about.
Yeah, it sounds very cool. And I'm looking forward to seeing how you, like, don't want to spoil the book for people. So, and also like we're running out a bit short of time, I'm looking forward to seeing how you kind of take that idea make it more universal, so that somebody who's listening, who's right now thinking, who is the equivalent of my divorce lawyers, can work that out. Because I think that's in a way, that's the killer move that she's got there. Isn't it? The combination of the niche and this referral partner, where you can make it a win for everybody, is a very, very cool way of thinking about it. Alex, like, we're coming towards the end of our time. What is that we haven't talked about, or haven't perhaps given the airtime or the space that it warrants in this conversation?
I think for me, the simple one is just, for me, and I know that you know this from me, but what this podcast has meant to me. So it's a bit meta being on this podcast, what it's meant to me, and the head start that it gave me in the coaching industry of learning from all these brilliant people and these conversations, and your generosity in sharing that journey. And then also how the Coaches Journey community has been such an important part of my journey so far in coaching, and also just informing so many things that I want to do. So it's almost like I'm still a member of the community, but even if I wasn't, I have so many ideas to take forward that I could take forward for the next 10 years if I wanted to. And so I'm just really excited about the listeners getting to know so many wonderful other people in that community who I count as friends, who all bring fascinating insights, and who I really thank for having helped me so much on my journey. And I just think it's a really exciting time for the podcast and the community. And I hope that this inspires more people to find out about the community and potentially get involved themselves.
Yeah, thank you, Alex, for saying that. And yeah, I feel the same. And what you just said there reminded me of one of the reasons why I have done group work with coaches for so long. Because when I was a member of a group for coaches, I mean, many groups for coaches, but particularly one structured similarly to how we work, you just get that thing which you're saying, which is like, because everybody's there, you've been a member of the community for quite a long time. You probably could have left after 6 months, and you've already by that point seen, because there's so many other people there, so many of the common, like such a high proportion of the common challenges, questions, issues, thoughts being wrestled with. And there's the two kind of sides of that. Is when you wrestle with them, you don't feel quite so insane anymore. And also, having seen somebody else go through something, you can't help but have your own thoughts sparked about that. So I do still think, I mean, groups generally, like I've been doing some group work with academic researchers this year, group coaching, and it's been true there, but particularly for coaches, a group coaching environment is such an amazing way, or same with group supervision, such an amazing way to learn about the intricacies of this kind of complex work that we do, or complex is true, but like varied. You were pointing to it earlier on when you were talking about the coaching industry, all the varied things that can come up under this umbrella of coaching. Yeah, it is a very powerful way to think about that. So, Alex, speaking of the community, members of the community, as regular listeners will know, can ask questions of guests. And we had a great question from Joey. People who recognize your names, who are regular listeners, might recognize it from the many questions you've asked guests via being a member of the community over the years. And I'm so appreciative of you for doing that. Joey sent in a great question to this, which I think is like a lovely place to kind of bring the conversation to a close, which is, and it's really tying up this conversation, really, or reflecting on the conversation as well. Because what she asked was, how do you tie together this sense of creating value and impact for people, which has been a part of your work at charities, through influencing, and through influence and the influence expert, and now through coaching? What is in your words, the golden thread, in hers, the congruent thread? What do they have in common?
I think for me, and I was thinking how to answer this question, I've got my values written up on the wall behind where I'm speaking to you, and it really just fits into my values. And when I say my values, I've done work on my values in the past few years, and it's taken time for me to, with a lot of work that I've done with this community and others, to crystallize them. But I've kind of mentioned them, but to mention all three of them, the first one is that humans are brilliant, and the correlating thing is I don't think enough people think that or say they think that. curiosity. Like, I really value curiosity in other people, but chiefly that's about, I'm curious about the world, and I think curiosity is my superpower. People often give me the impression that I get more excited about projects other people are doing than they are, or maybe even about my own projects. I don't know. And the final one is, life is better when you choose. So when people have some agency in their life and they make choices about things, then I think that that's much better for them and for the world. And so all the work I've done fits into these things: supporting people and being curious about their lives, and empowering people and giving people choices. And so it's not about some sort of paternalistic, I know better. It's very much, you are the experts of your life. I want to support you, and I believe in you, and I champion you. And that's really led me to coaching, because that's what it feels like coaching is for me. And that's how I've experienced coaching from you, Robbie, and from other people as an experiential thing. That's what I get out of coaching probably as well. So that ties it up, hopefully.
Fantastic. It just reminded me that I was thinking about you and coaching, and obviously before this call, and I came back into this office before the call, and I'd left your website homepage up, and I was like, of course he's a coach. Across the top of it, it said, "Don't wait to be chosen to make a difference in the world," which is like, in a way, is the like is quite, holds quite a lot of that common thread that you just spoke about. Look, Alex, like I've already said, I'm super excited to have you as part of the team, and to have you helping me to do something with this thing that means a lot to us all, and hopefully make it more impactful and reach more people and have even more influence. I'm looking forward as a listener. It's the first time, when an interview that you run or somebody else runs comes out, I'm going to get to be a real listener to the show, which I'm so excited about. There'll be lots of chance for people to get to know you more. We've signposted them to lots of places already as well. One I've forgotten to mention is you can actually watch a video of me coaching Alex. It's from a long time ago, so don't judge my coaching too much. I had far fewer hours of coaching by then, but my memory of it is it's a great session. And it's, another aspect of you use that to influence people as well, that piece of content. But where people will put links to where you are, your website, the Influence Expert website, and other things in the show notes. But is there anywhere particular that you'd like to send people?
I think for people to connect with me on LinkedIn, really. I'm quite a LinkedIn geek, as we've kind of discussed. And if somebody wants to connect with me, just say they heard me on your show or something like that. I think that would be a really good place. And also, while my profile is by no means perfect, hopefully that way they'll learn some things by the content I've put on LinkedIn, including about how to use LinkedIn, that will be helpful for them.
Yeah, great stuff. And there's a cool product that you can buy from Alex, like where he'll, like, on his website, where he'll like look at your LinkedIn and give you tips, which is a great thing to do. So Alex, it's been such a pleasure. Obviously I won't be with you next time you're on the Coach's Journey podcast, but listeners will hear your voice again sometime pretty soon.
Thank you, Robbie. It's been a real pleasure and a privilege. Thank you.